Welcome back, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the podcast Knowledge Unbound. For those of you who are new to us, we are an interview podcast where we've been in conversation with people who do social justice work in science education and education in general. Knowledge Unbound is brought to you by the Rios Institute for a racially just, inclusive, open STEM education. We are generously funded by the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation. I'm joined here in the studio by my wonderful producer, Mr. Segev Amasai. Segev, what's up?
Hello, everyone. It is a pleasure to be back for this second installment of the unbinding of knowledge.
I'll cut your mic. I swear to God, I'll cut your mic. Did you work on that? Like the way you said that, I feel like you practiced that voice.
Well, maybe.
All right.
Who knows?
Segev is a computer engineering major, class of 2025. And Segev is going to apply and receive a ton of scholarships this week to make sure he graduates debt-free. Am I right?
That is correct.
Segev is a wonderful producer for these episodes. Thank you so much. Today we have a really exciting conversation for you. I'll be talking to Dr. Beronda Montgomery. Dr. Montgomery is the Vice President for Academic Affairs at Grinnell College in Iowa. She's also the author of a very wonderful book called Lessons from Plants. And she's been known in science education and education circles for a long time as somebody who really, really thinks deeply and thoughtfully about mentoring and inclusive education in science. And we unpacked that. We went on that journey and it was just so good to hear her really give thoughtful reasons for everything and why. And I really hope you enjoy every element of this conversation, from the personal to the professional. And I hope it inspires you as much as it did me. Welcome. So I know when when we go to places to give talks, and I say I know I do this from time to time, they read the CV thing, right?
Yes.
But I've heard you say offline that if people look at your CV, they will see a very traditional ladder, right?
Yes.
What you kind of expect of an academic. But there's a lot of non-traditionality that sort of encircles that has led to that. So wondering if maybe by way of introduction, you could kind of unpack that statement for the audience.
Absolutely. So I think even as early as where I did my undergraduate degree at Washington University with a bachelor's degree in biology, ultimately, I had no intention to be a biology professor. So I had decided really early that I wanted to be a lawyer. And then in middle school, it was clear I was really good at science and math. And so through kind of reason and deduction, I decided I wanted to be a biotech lawyer.
Okay.
So as an undergrad, I was pre-law, focused on getting into law school, and ultimately committed to that until the very senior year when I decided to do an undergraduate research experience to understand the science I would be writing patents about. But that undergraduate research experience just changed the whole trajectory, and that I hadn't known any professors, and the idea that you could have a career just pursuing curiosity. So I decided not to go to law school and instead to try to get into graduate school.
Time out. Did you just say you hadn't known any professors?
I hadn't known any professors personally.
Oh, okay.
Right? When I decided to be a lawyer, I knew, I grew up in a neighborhood where being a lawyer, a doctor, a teacher were things,
right.
even though there were few in the neighborhood, those were valuable careers.
I just find it a little remarkable. This is obviously not on you, but just that so many of our students come to university and they are literally surrounded by professors.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
And at least in my experience, so many of them don't even think this is a thing.
Absolutely.
Right? I just wonder, how is it we don't lean into that reality that they are being taught by us, mentored, served by us, and we don't kind of explicitly lay our pathway out to the point where they don't even make it a consideration.
No, I think it's a really important point, which is something I brought into my own career of being a professor, is to have conversations with them about why I chose this path and how it is a possibility. Because I think too many of us look at them only as teachers in the classroom or professors in the research, and often they don't lean into it. Frequently, when we do lean into it as a professor, we're telling how stressful it is, how stressed out we are. And so leaning into it as a space of possibility is a completely different kind of thing.
How you have that conversation. So, okay, you're going to be a patent lawyer.
Yes. So then ultimately, after I did an undergraduate research experience and realized that I could have a career of pursuing interesting questions and mentoring students, I decided to take a year and work as a technician back in Arkansas. And ultimately, the person I was working for said, "You're doing really great work. You should get a master's degree while you decide what you're going to do." So I got a master's degree, spent 2 years, and then went to graduate school. During the master's degree, I took all kinds of classes to decide what area of biology I wanted.
And where was the master's?
University of Central Arkansas. So I'm from Little Rock, Arkansas. I went back home. And I took a whole range of classes. I did work assessing snakes in nature. I worked with rats. I did a whole kinds of things. And then I took a plant physiology class.
How do you assess snakes?
Well, you look at where they are. You look at the population. You look at how the aging of the population. My mother was shocked because I am not that kind of person. But it was the person who was doing that work. It was a great mentor. So I wanted to work with her. Okay. And then ultimately I took a plant physiology class, not even really interested in the class, but it fit a schedule. And the professor was so enthusiastic. And I had thought at that point that plants were boring, and he really brought them to life. And that's when I made the decision to go to graduate school in plant biology.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I'm thinking like assessing snakes. I see you.
You're stuck on the snakes.
I run the next direction. I've assessed the situation.
Picking them up. I was like, oh, this. I was in. The mentors can get you to do things you never thought you would do.
I know. So I want to, before we move on career-wise, I want to talk a little bit about Little Rock.
Yes.
Right. You mentioned earlier about, in that community, there are these very particular career choices that you typically went after.
Yes.
Right. Can you tell me a little bit more about that community?
Yeah, so I grew up in the city, right in the city in Little Rock, a working class family. So my mother had gotten her associate's degree from Shorter College, which is a historically black college in Little Rock, Arkansas. Both my parents were from the Delta region. They grew up in agricultural Delta region. And so my mom had an associate's degree. My dad did not graduate from high school and went back after they were married and got his GED. So I came from a family that education was valued, but it wasn't a family that was deep into education.
Right.
And so we grew up, and of course my parents wanted us to do well in school, but it was kind of a working class community. And as it was clear that I was excelling at school, the default was you should be a lawyer or you should be a doctor. And we did have a few teachers in the neighborhood. And so those all seemed like valuable careers. And I had a brother who was into music, and it was like, nope, that's not a path towards sustainability.
Is that a reflection on him, or you just understood?
No, it's like when we had people who were in these areas. My family was like, how do you make a living there?
Yeah,
so my parents had worked really hard to get out of poverty. They grew up in poverty in the Delta region of Arkansas. I was telling someone recently, both my parents were pulled out of school every spring to pick cotton with their parents to make extra money. So they grew up really having to struggle to make it. And so for them, they really wanted us to focus on getting to a path that we could sustain our lives.
Right.
And so even I remember when I decided I wasn't going to go to law school, that was a long conversation with my mother. She was like, I think you should still go and you could do that later. But it was just this idea, those seemed to be paths that you could get a good job, sustainability, and make a life for yourself. And so really the community was trying to help us choose paths that would keep us on a path of economic sustainability, really. Yeah.
So you keep using the word community, which I appreciate.
Yes.
But I'm wondering from a numerical standpoint, was that encouragement beyond just your family?
Absolutely. So I grew up at a time where really it was like the whole neighborhood was raising you, right?
Yeah,
and
right.
Across the street, there was a woman who owned a daycare. And so if we were out of school, we would go to her daycare. And so I grew up at a time where you would be outside and anyone could correct you, right? The woman 2 doors down, we could freely go down there, but it was this community where they looked out for us and my mom looked out for their kids. So it really was a couple of blocks of people who had become more than neighbors and were friends, and it really was this kind of village-like atmosphere where if you did something wrong, by the time you got home, your mother already knew. If you did something good, the entire neighborhood celebrated.
Right.
So I really did grow up in that kind of, it was a communal raising of everyone. Yeah.
Is any family members still there?
Yeah, so all of my family is still there. So I'm the youngest of 5 kids. My father passed away in 2019, but he and my mother lived in Little Rock or right outside their entire marriage. My mom is still there. And all 5 of us kids at one point moved away. Everyone else has migrated back other than me. So everybody else now is within probably 30, 40-mile radius.
You're a prodigal child. I'm
Yes.
gonna come for Thanksgiving.
Yeah.
See you
Yes,
a couple
yes.
times a year. Right?
Well, I tell them they need somewhere to visit, right?
Well, how is that community now?
You know, the community has changed. I was talking about this with my mother because I was there some time ago and someone ran out into the street, a young girl from across the street. And I just by instinct said, get out of the street, be careful. And later they came to my mom and said, please tell your daughter don't yell at my child,
Damn.
right? And so I think we've broken down and kind of gone back into our entrenchments, which, I'm like, I have a son. I'm like, anybody who sees him in danger, snatch him, right? And we can talk about why you snatched him later. But I think we have lost some of that, not in all places, but some of it has broken down as the city's grown and, there are other challenges.
So, I'm excited for our conversation, but there is a part of me that almost wants to talk to your mom.
She's the one to talk
to. Who
Yes.
would have grown up in a very different era and
Yes.
watched that through
Yes.
her own growing up and then raised you and your siblings and watched that change and then now in 2023 and
Well, it's so interesting. We have some amazing conversations about equity and equality and sometimes some deep family debates. Because my parents who grew up at a time where my mom is brilliant, a brilliant mathematician. We always say she could have been the first professor if she wasn't brought up at this time.
Yeah.
And so they look at things and talk about how much things have changed. And my siblings and I are like, things are still pretty bad. And so we have this whole conversation about whether we're in a better state. And it is fascinating to talk with them because I do think often we can lose sight of how far we've come. Right? Because I sit there and talk with my mother who didn't have the possibilities that I have. And so, no, I think you're right. There's a lot. My son's, one of his teachers in middle school had as an assignment that they talk to someone who was in their 80s or so who wasn't their grandparent, right, about their experience. Because I think we do sometimes, we can focus so much on what all the paths we still need to take that we forget we've come some ways. Yeah.
So I'm assuming at some point your mother's mother and perhaps even your dad's mother was alive. What, you talk about your son's assignment, right? What about your assignment, right? What about when you were growing up and talking to them about that time period and then you kind of reflect on your life now? How has some of those stories kind of come through the generations of your family?
It's really amazing. I used to spend a lot of time with my maternal grandfather. He would sit on the porch of his home.
Same community?
No, this is in Helena, West Helena. So this deep in the country, right between Memphis and Little Rock. And we would get sent there in the summer for a couple weeks, and I would sit with him on the porch almost all day because he was mostly quiet. And I could sit there and read. But every once in a while, he would bring up a story. And it was fascinating because my maternal grandfather was born and lived in Elaine, Arkansas, which is a site of a major racial insurrection. And he remembered that, right? And so sitting there and talking to him about that, sometimes it was shocking. And now when I read about these histories, we come through these really deep kind of generational, I call it a generational lineage of bravery, a generational lineage of hope. Someone asked me, how do I remain hopeful? And I said, I come from a generational lineage of hope, and I'm not going to be the one to drop it. And so I do think it's so important to connect with those prior generations, to understand kind of what our lineage is, what we're made of, but also kind of what the paths of success, the paths of change, and where we still have struggles.
So were there things that, in talking with your maternal grandfather, that then came to inform your own thinking about your work, about your thoughts on equity and social justice? And I want to maybe add some nuance to this question because I know, just thinking about my own life, right? When I was 18, 15 or whatever, and I would have similar conversations with my dad in a Caribbean context.
Yes.
I didn't at 15 say, ooh, when I become a professor at 34, this is going to impact how I teach my class, right? But when I teach my class, I realize I'm recalling things from my ancestors, things
Yes.
from the way I was raised, things from his own past in ways that I hadn't planned.
Yes.
Right. And I'm just wondering what that journey was like for you.
No, I think similar to you, some of them I've come to know later or to recognize them, right. Later. One of the biggest ones is that my family has always had this sense that the kind of sense of Sankofa, right? You're always looking back. You're going to get something, but you're looking back. And it's been a practice in our family. Like if you go off and get education, then you need to bring it back in a way that we all can process it and benefit from it. And I look at that now a lot in the ways that I go about collaborations and the ways that I go about mentoring. It's really trying to encourage people, okay, you've gotten this knowledge. What are you going to do with it beyond yourself? Because we existed in a space. It's both fun and humorous, right? Even now when I go back for Thanksgiving, I can be talking to my mom about a major accomplishment, and she's like, yeah, that's cute. Get the sweet potato pie done. This is your job today, right? And so there's this constant, but then you hear her telling the story to someone else with great pride. So there's this constant negotiation of you've done an amazing thing, and yet that doesn't just belong to you, and you can't let it elevate you. And I think that one of the dangers of the academy for me is that it can sometimes be easy to try to, the academy kind of encourages you and pushes you into that space of, look at all you did, celebrate yourself. And I'm constantly reminding myself and those I work with that this is a communal knowledge and we don't get it alone. So we can't just take the spoils alone.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Did you get the sweet potato pie done?
Yeah, I did.
Okay. So you took this really interesting plant physiology class.
Yes.
Piqued your interest.
Yes.
I take it that's what then led to pursuing that at a doctoral level.
Right. That's right. Yeah. So that was ultimately, I became really fascinated with how plants have to spend their whole life in this one place, right? And so if we are unhappy, we move somewhere else, but they're there. And so they have to be really sensitive to what's going on around them. And that was so fascinating to me. I wanted to learn more about that. And the more I studied plants, the more parallels I saw in terms of communities broadly. And so I just became completely and totally fascinated with them. Yeah.
So you're fascinated with plants.
Yes.
Right. And I know that for several years, I think you've said several times that you're a trained biochemist.
Yeah.
That was sort of the lens through which that was studied, and it was several years in, right, that you started to make this very explicit connection between mentoring and some of the things that you were internalizing from your work with plants. Could you walk us through that transition? I don't want to call it a transition because it's not like you stopped being a biochemist per se, but there was some metaphors that were becoming more apparent, and so what surfaced that for you?
Yes.
And then what made the change happen?
So I think pretty early in my career, I started to really struggle with the way. So my entire academic career until recently was at a primarily white institution, Research One. I'm still at primarily white. And one of the challenges I really started to deal with in the scientific spaces were that we study these amazing systems and we understand how critically important the external environment is for the success of these systems that we study. And yet with the humans we were interacting with, we shut all of that off. And we're judging people based on what we felt their capabilities were, their own personal agency from deficit perspective. So during my first few years in my tenure track position, there were 6 Black women recruited to PhD programs, not to my lab, but in PhD programs that I was associated with. And I was really excited because the timing was such that if I got tenure and was successful, they should be finishing their PhDs. And I said, we're going to have the biggest Black women in STEM success party when this happens. So I kind of had my head down, focused on tenure. And as I was getting close, I started to look, okay, where are they? They all 6 were gone. Nobody with a PhD. So 3 of them decided the environment wasn't for them and left. The other 3 got to the point where they didn't get successfully through, so they left with master's degrees. And when I was talking to the program directors about what had happened, there were these conversations that some of them we had recruited from HBCUs. They couldn't make the transition. And others,
this is the directors saying this to you.
Yeah.
Right, yeah.
And so there was this whole deficit framing, right, that they hadn't made it. And I said, I knew at least 4 or 5 of these women, and they were brilliant. So, and they also have been successful elsewhere. right? They came to us having demonstrated success. And I also started citing papers for them that HBCUs are actually the training ground for a vast majority of Black people who go on to get their PhDs. And so I asked the question at that time, we have to stop and say, what did we do to derail their success?
Right.
And when I would enter those conversations, what I would find is that people's defenses would go up really quickly.
Right.
Because we're talking about race, we're talking about gender, we're talking about whether the primarily white spaces have done their work. And so I was desperate to find a way to get deeper into the conversation before people shut down. And several of the people on this first committee were plant biologists. And I said, you all understand this, right? And I started to break it down to them. And not to say it transformed everything, but they couldn't deny that we understand this in a biological context and we don't use it in our own environments. So I really started to use the plants as a way to say, you know, if a plant is growing and it's struggling in its health, we don't look at the plant and say, well, you plant have a deficit and can't grow, right? We start to ask questions. Who watered it last? Does it need nutrients? Does Brian always kill plants? If so, maybe he shouldn't have plants. Or let me teach him how to do it.
I would like my listeners to know that I have a green thumb.
You have a garden with great tomatoes. Or, you know, what would happen? My mother has a great green thumb. When we were growing up, sick plants would show up on the porch. And they'd say, can you nurse us back to health and then health and tell me what you did? So it's because we interact with plants from an expectation that they should grow. And I simply started asking what would happen if we interacted with each other from that perspective. And it's hard for people to deny that. And so we could get deep into the conversation before people realized that I was saying, yeah, you're the problem. Right? You're killing the plants. So it was really a desperation to ask, how can we have questions about topics that otherwise, if we focused on the humans, would shut down before we could get to some insights?
Right. Yeah. Let me ask you 2 follow-up questions on that.
Yes.
One is maybe based on, you know, the way in which I remember learning biology early on, which may not have been correct, but this very clear message that the difference between humans and, say, a plant is that we are sentient beings, right? That we have consciousness, we can make a decision. And when I've reflected on what that statement came up in my mind again when I read your book, Lessons from Plants. And I guess my takeaway was not from the book, but from that lesson is that message then kind of, I don't want to say it gave us too much agency, but it completely negated the role of environment.
Yes.
Right? It's almost as though conscientiousness was it.
Everything.
That was your whole being.
Yes.
Right? And so I wonder if part of the problem that you're describing here is a big pendulum swing towards this, you know, and especially we can bring up sort of the culture of America and the pull your bootstraps up kind of thing.
Yeah.
So that's the point number 1. And then number 2 is specifically in academia, where you're raised to be the smartest person in the room and the problem solver and the one with all the answers. Is it a difficult conversation when a Beronda Montgomery comes along and says, you know, we might actually be part of the problem, right? We are creators of the environment. So how has those themes bubbled up in the conversations? How have people responded, and how do you sort of get around defensiveness?
No, I think it's a really important point. You know, the first point you make about consciousness, I had a great conversation with someone also from the Caribbean. Maybe you guys are thinking, but this idea of how do we balance the fact that we as humans do have agency in a different way than other organisms. And I agree with your point that we can go so far to agency that we still ignore that what we know. And so people who study any kind of organism, whether it's mammals or environment impacts them, right? That impacts their capacity for growth. It doesn't completely reprogram that, but it impacts their capacity. And I think we do put so much into consciousness that we forget we are still biological organisms subject to our environments, impacted by community. I think also your point about us being the smartest in the room, it really goes to this idea that much of academia is built on an individual success model.
Right.
And even when we don't, most of us, hardly anyone does all their work alone, we still reward it, right? And so every time I stand on a stage for an award, there are dozens of undergraduates, graduates, postdocs, collaborators, but somehow we tease it apart into individual success. And because our systems resist the idea of collective success, we go back to that. And it can be really hard then to understand that collective success means we need collective stewardship.
Right.
Those two have to go hand in hand. I think the last thing that I would say related to the 2 two points that you brought up is that, you said what happens when someone comes in and say, you're wrong, we need to change. One of our hardest challenges, I'm convinced, that we still have to grapple with is that it's really difficult to ask people to change the system that affirmed them. Because if the system affirmed you, it must be good, right? And I think we have to get to a place to say that I managed to navigate the system and it worked. But how are we going to make sure that there are microenvironments or microclimates so that more people of different kinds, because what happens is you get people who are very similar, or you get people, you can take yourself out of this category. You get people like me and you who are finding our own way, but we're not depending on the system to tell us we've got it right. But there's a whole range of other people who we need to be at the table.
Yeah, I mean, because one of the takeaway messages for me from that path, which you accurately described, is, but who else got left out?
Yes.
Because they didn't have that navigational capital, right? They didn't have, the parents I had who said, no, your decisions are guided by your values, not by anybody's dictation to you. And
And I think if I could say, I think one of the things we have to recognize is that when those people get left out, it's not just the sadness that they got left out. I get sad that the system then couldn't benefit from their input and also change. So the systems haven't evolved and individuals haven't been successful. And until we see both of those as detriments, we'll keep thinking we're just helping people be successful. But our systems are actually suffering from not having that diverse input.
Right. So what happened were there any changes made in the program as a result of the conversations and
so
about
we did make some changes, and one of them was that we moved to having additional people in the graduate school as well as the provost office who could do mentor training. And a lot of them use the mentor training work that comes out of University of Wisconsin with Angela Byers-Winston and Chris Funn. So trying to get mentors to think about students beyond just what they're producing, using some of their culturally competent mentoring. So that was one step. I think the challenge that I was still pressing on while I was still there is that those kinds of changes are good. And yet, if we don't change the administrators who are assessing us or the ways in which we get assessed, we can make better individual mentors, but the system doesn't change.
Yeah, I want to talk about that a bit because administrators, I know you've been one for a while. Actually, let me put a plug on that real quick because I want to go back, just chronologically speaking, back to there was a point where you went full on mentoring.
Yes,
like this is gonna be what you write about, research on. Was it that conversation, that experience you had with that group and the 6 Black women who didn't finish? Was that the thing that turned your work into full-on mentoring, or did that come later?
So that was the catalyst for me to start getting involved myself in understanding what was possible in mentoring. And so at that point, I didn't know what I didn't know. And so I did what I would do with any experiment at the bench. I went to say, what's in the literature? What can we learn? And how can we put that in our practices? So I started first trying to learn myself what was out there and how to implement it, but then to be in community. And so for a long time, I was doing mentoring kind of service. I was on committees. I was working for my disciplinary society. And a mentor of my own said that if you're going to continue to do this work in meaningful ways, you've got to capture it in ways that the university will give you time and commitment to do it. So what I have always encouraged people is that if you have something that's critically important to you and you understand the powerful ways in which institutions look at that, whether it's writing, research grants, talks, then you have to figure out which of those paths is something that you can do and capture that work. I'm a writer. I love to write. So I said I can start writing about mentoring and capture it as scholarship.
Okay.
And then I volunteered to be a co-PI on a grant for disciplinary society. So I had grant money and papers, and people started to refer to me as a scholar. Because that's what makes you a scholar, right?
That's the currency.
And so I pulled it into my kind of scholarship such that by the time I went up for promotion to full, they recognized that along with my biochemistry papers. Yeah.
Okay. Very nice. So I like your very positive take on it being an administrator.
Yeah, I don't know if it's completely positive, but let's see.
Well, I know it's a mixed bag, but I want to get into it because it's something that's been thrown my way, not offers per se, but just discussions as sort of my own growth has happened. And my kids are young right now. I think there's a lot of things on the table that perhaps I see it in the future, but not now. And I look at higher ed academia, I look at some administrative bloat, maybe some cases where that's an unfair criticism, but cases where it is fair. And I try to be fair in my assessment, right? Because at the end of the day, somebody has to run the university. Somebody has to keep the lights on. Somebody has to keep the budgets balanced. Somebody has to enforce rules. I mean,
Yes.
so somebody has to be there doing the things that perhaps we who just want to teach and write papers
Right.
don't either have time for or want to. The upside of, I think, that role is kind of what you said is when you look, if you see inequity as a systemic issue, and you have a little bit more power and privilege in that system, then you have more opportunities
Yes.
to right that ship in ways that you can't as much as a
Right.
faculty member, even
Right.
a full professor.
Yes.
So knowing that you have that mindset,
Yes.
how did you kind of approach your various administrator roles and able to kind of implement that?
Yeah, so I got into administration the same way I got into mentoring scholarship, to be frank. So I was doing mentoring scholarship and realized that we could work on mentoring, but we were going to have to work on leadership, right, to get this. And so then I started doing academic leader scholarship, writing
Right,
papers.
right.
And ultimately, that work that I was doing started to have impact nationally. I was working with a lot of colleges and universities. And so Michigan State, where I was at the time, wanted me to start working with department chairs and such. And they just said, can you go help this department? Like a department would call me up. And my mentor said, they're going to pull you left and right doing this and still have all the same expectations
Right,
for you.
right.
So you need to tell them this is leadership. So they actually, the first role I had was a brand new role. They created a role as assistant provost for faculty development focused on research
Okay.
to teach department chairs and deans how to set up mentoring programs. And I have always been of the mindset that I'm not really like dying to be an administrator, but if you're going to be one, you want to be one where you have a title and a budget where you can impact. So I negotiated the title so that it would be one that the deans and chairs knew they had to listen. This wasn't
Right.
just that she's doing good work.
Yeah.
So I became an administrator to capture the time to do the work that the college had started to call up me on. And it was really trying to have a balanced life. It was going to be too much. And so I said, if you all want me to do this, you need to create some time. So I was a part-time administrator to create that time and to get a budget to do that work. And then realized that you can try to have impact in that regard if you
Yeah.
can get your administrative higher ups to set the evaluation systems. And they gave me a budget. And once I had a few $1 million, the deans were like, well, we guess we have to listen. And so part of
Not the
it,
title, the budget, right?
so I realized a budget and title opens ears.
Right.
And so for me, then those are the roles that I've taken on, not because I when I was in a leadership program once, several of the people, I say, what do you want to do? They say, I want to be a dean. I want to be this. They said, Beronda, what do you want to do? And I said, I want to be able to impact our systems so that people have equitable chances to understand pathways towards success, the struggle. So it's about that for
Right,
me.
right.
And then it becomes which position has a budget that allows you to set that as a
Right.
standard, not just for individuals, but hopefully from a systemic
Yeah.
perspective.
Yeah. So you have the why first.
Yes, yes.
And we can figure out the title
Absolutely.
and the budget stuff
Absolutely.
after. So what are some of the things that you've really enjoyed about being in that position, and what are some of the challenges that you feel you have to navigate?
So I think the challenges, I'll start with those. The challenges are that systems are designed to function as they have. That's what an institution.
Inherently conservative,
Yes.
right? Yeah.
And so a lot of the change that I see needs to happen, trying to come up with a strategy, find the counterparts who will work with you, that is intense mental work. Sometimes finding the resources. And often it looks like we're going to start moving towards success, and then we hit the structures of, if we do that, how's it going to impact our graduation rate? How's it going to impact our ranking? And I have argued that sometimes if you know something is the right thing to do, to right the ship, your graduation rate might drop a couple years because you got to get something. And we can't be worried about that. Those are the challenging parts. The systems are designed to stay the same. They are designed for status quo.
Right.
They are designed for the appearance of change. There's this leadership author called Deborah Rowland who says that often our approaches towards change leadership are to layer change on the system. And I always say that's like putting chocolate frosting on a vanilla cake and telling someone they have chocolate cake. I like chocolate cake. That is not chocolate cake. That is vanilla cake with chocolate frosting, right? That's the
You
hard
don't need
part.
to get bread pudding. I'm just saying.
Oh,
if we're gonna
yes,
start talking desserts here, I mean, call it like you see it.
But I think the things that keep me at the table are that for me personally, and many people I know, my personal friends in the academy who have done kind of out of the box things, most of us had to fight to do that. or we had to do it even when we knew it wasn't going to be recognized, or we had to really make our own case. And that can be exhausting. And one of the things that I like about being an administrator is that if you figure out the system well enough, sometimes you can use levers that are there to make different things possible for people. You can invest in new areas. And so I think for me, one of the things that brought me to administration is to ask what work I could do to try to make it a little easier for someone who sees their career in a non-standard way, the way I see mine, not have to fight so hard to do it. Because there are a lot of people who left because they didn't want to fight.
Right.
And if I can work in an administrative space and keep at least some of them at the table to make their unique contributions, that can put institutions on paths that I think they need to go. Yeah.
Are you beginning to see good examples of that out there in the field?
I do think so. I mean, I look at, in addition to being an administrator at a couple of places, I've also done a lot of consulting across higher education. And I think some of the things I've had a chance to collaborate on, either as a consultant or in the spaces I've been, you see people at the current institution I'm at, we've done a couple of pilots, right, to try to make teaching flexible enough for people to do the work that's meaningful for them, that's not seen as standard teaching, but to get it recognized as teaching. And you see these people really excited about their work. Some of them who are doing community engaged work, you see the communities change. But the ways that I know it's having impact is that I now have new people coming to the table said, I've been thinking about this thing that's out of the box. Is it possible to think about? And in the past, they probably would have never spoken about that with someone in my role. But inviting people to the table to do that kind of thing, I think can have impact locally and hopefully over the long time get us to rethink our systems a little bit altogether.
Right. Let's talk a little bit about lessons from plants.
Yes.
What made that happen? What led to that book? Why was the book we needed? Well, why was that book we needed for 2020 came out?
Came out 2021.
2021.
Yeah.
What led to that project? What was it like making that happen? What kind of impact you're hoping that happens in the community?
I love to share the story because I at that time writing a book was not on my radar.
Okay.
I went to give a talk at a conference. I was in the opening night presidential symposium at a microbiology conference, giving a very technical talk on biochemistry and proteins and how it affects. And I gave that talk, and every time I give a talk, my goal is not to impress anyone with my knowledge, but to invite them into my enthusiasm for science and then come with the facts. And I gave that talk, went back to my room, and got an email from the person who became my editor at Harvard University Press. Said, I'm here in the exhibit hall exhibiting books. Have you ever thought about writing a book? I heard your talk and it was great. And I said to her, I have to have coffee with you just to understand how we got from, mutating cysteines to prolines, and can you write a book?
Right.
And so when I talked with her, and I actually had the conversation with her because at that time I was assistant provost for faculty development, now in charge of supporting faculty who wrote books, and I had never written a book. So I said, if nothing else, I'll learn more about this process to support the faculty. And I said to her, she said, you were so clear and enthusiastic that I know I can send you on a book tour. I just need you to write a book. And so she said, what have you been thinking about? So initially we were thinking about writing a very academic book on how photosynthetic organisms respond to light. We were going to go for very academic. I said, but I also have written a couple of papers about lessons from plants and what I think humans can learn from plants. And she said, your whole face lit up with that. So let's go that direction. So we went that direction of writing it. And there was some serendipity. I wrote the book, and my goal of writing the book was that if someone were a plant biologist, they could hand it to their family who had no plant biologist, and the plant biology would be accessible enough.
Right.
But also that someone who just has a very small interest in plants could pick it up, learn something, but also perhaps learn what plants had to share with us about being better humans. And so I was not really sure what would happen with the book. And then the book came out during the pandemic. And I don't know if you remember this, but during the pandemic, people were growing lettuce from scraps. They were falling in love with house plants. There was like Monstera Monday. So there was all this interest of plants at the time the book came out. And I was devastated. I was like, I can't go on book tour. But it ended up being amazing because all these people were sitting at home. And then I got very lucky. 2 early people who do podcasts, Jonathan Van Ness, who does Getting Curious and is also on Queer Eye on Netflix, loves plants. So he was one of the first people to reach out and say, can we talk about plants? And then Alan Alda reached out.
Yeah.
And so it was perfect because Jonathan Van Ness was a audience that I would probably, a younger audience. And Alan Alda was someone who my mom says, oh, yes, I know who this is, right? And so it was this whole range. But I think it was just serendipity of this person saying, have you written a book? I'd like to write. I thought I'd learn something to support faculty, do my core job better. And then it came out at a time where people were fascinated with plants. And I had some unusual opportunities to really get out there and talk about it publicly.
Okay.
But I think it also just resonates with people. You don't have to be a scientist to say, yep, if I see a plant that's wilting, I would give it water.
Right.
And then the translation to what that means about community.
I just saying. She's like, I didn't see it. It's literally next. Anyway, whatever. So okay. Speaking of kind of accessibility and relatability of it, there's a couple of things that came up. When I read it, I thought several things were interesting, but just for the interest of time, I want to zero in on two things. And one was this discussion about the things in your professional and personal life don't have to exist in competition. Yes. And I think that's a really important point because, one of my favorite former ESPN panelists was Jamil Hill. And she used to have a phrase, she used to say DTM, doing too much.
Yes.
And she used to use that to describe, I think mostly basketballers who were just trying to, ball handle and dunk away. Yeah. I don't know. For some reason, I love the phrase. But I feel it's an apt phrase to describe what's expected of us in a very consumer-driven society, right? And it for me, it's a math problem, right? You have 24 hours in a day, and you have to keep your marriage interesting. You have to be a good parent. You have to spend time with the children, keep up with the news, know who to vote for, teach your classes well, publish, get money, exercise 8 hours. I mean, and at some point you're like, well, okay, something on this is not going to happen, right?
Yes.
And unfortunately, I've seen so many cases where the thing that gave was the personal relationships, was the health, right? Because that mortgage is not going to pay itself, so you have to do the bean counting to get the and all of that stuff. So you take that on explicitly. So talk to us a little bit about how you manage that conflict to make it not a conflict.
Yeah, I think one of the things I tried to do really early was to see synergy between those areas, right? And so I do have a son, and it was critically important to me when he was in his kind of elementary school stage. I would try to be done 5:30 to 6, and 6 until his bedtime, I would try for that to be his time. Right. And then there would be some times where something would come up, and so it's how do I deal with this? And so I always tried to say, okay, if I've got to go out to the field, how do we make it fun for him, right? If I've got to go into the lab, how do I make it fun for him? So for years, he had a bench in the lab
nice.
where we worked with these organisms where when you extracted the proteins, they were very colorful. So he had all these tubes that were food color, but he thought they were proteins, right? And so he would be there and,
academic misconduct.
Yes, yeah. So he would be there in this little room. It was the food safety, right? So he's working. And so it was a case of, if I have to have you in my space, how do I make you think this is also about you and for you? The other thing that I learned really early was I built a community. I had a group of several women at Michigan State who we all had kids. And one of the things we did was we all had boys that were then 5 years of each other.
Okay.
We got them to love each other. And then every Wednesday night, one of us had all of the boys.
Okay.
So for 4 Wednesday nights a month, he was with his friends. Right. And one Wednesday I was overwhelmed.
Right.
But it was so important because
can't imagine why.
it taught us that we needed to depend on each other, but it also taught the kids that they needed to learn how to depend on other adults. And literally, they were having the time of their lives.
Yeah.
And then the last thing I did is, sometimes in these spaces, it is inevitable that a grant deadline or something is immovable.
Right.
So I've had a principle that if I have to ignore my loved one, I should honor them. So, my son loved Legos. My partner loved golf. So if it was a weekend that I knew I couldn't get away, I'm like, I booked you a golf weekend with your friends.
Yeah.
And they were like, this is lovely. Or I would buy my son on weekends I knew I had work to do. I would buy him a 700-piece Lego kit. Right. And he would say, oh, my God. He said, Mom, I feel bad because I'm going to be so busy this weekend with this kid. I said, it's okay.
I think we'll be all right here.
Right. And so it's how can you honor someone if you have to be apart from them? And so I think there are ways to still try not to, because I agree with you, too many Relationships fall apart. Kids' relationships are not as strong as they could be because we don't figure out that how can I honor you even in this space where there's another demand on my time.
And I'll take this point a step further because, this is not just about academia life, but this is the kind of topics that you write about, talk about, has everything to do with equity mindedness, has to do with social justice, has to do with, like how do we create this environment for our students and for our colleagues. And I dare say more than, say, studying protein folding.
Yes, absolutely.
That kind of work can be very exhausting, right? And, a piece of advice I try to, share with people is like, you can't measure the quality of this type of work by how exhausted you are, right? And the goal isn't to get, oh my God, I'm so tired.
We have exhaustion Olympics.
All weekend I was fighting equity, I mean, that can't be the model. But so that means that you have to have a strategy as an activist or as a worker in this space to manage that.
Yes.
So a little bit separate from academia and some of the more kind of logistical things, how do you manage that piece?
Yeah, I think the most important part is that you have to recognize you have to have a group. Right? A group of like-minded people. And it doesn't mean we think exactly alike, right? But I have a group of people who do a certain kind of work. I have a group of women who I work with we're all interested in promoting diversity in the academy. And so sometimes I'm exhausted and can't speak up, but I can tag Robin in. Robin, sometimes they will say, you're tired, you need to rest, we've got this, right? And so I think you do have to, I think earlier we were talking in some context about civil rights, right, and marching. And I have a sister who loves civil rights, and she always says that she would love to march. And I said, oh, that would be great. She said, but I would march in the middle. Right? And I said, well, why the middle? I said, why not get in the back? She said, no, you don't want to be in the back, right? Because if you're at the forefront, you might be the one that faces the danger.
Right.
But if you get turned back, the back becomes the front, right?
Right.
And so the middle you can support but not be, and I think you have to have a collective where you can rotate into the middle.
Yeah.
Sometimes you're at
All
the
right.
front,
Yeah.
sometimes you're at the back ready to be in the front, but sometimes you have to be in the middle and saying, I'm still here, holding up the structure, but I can relax a little bit. And I think that's been critically important. And it's one of the things I try to tell students so much because a lot of times they're trying to do work against all this power. And so you have to have a group that some have more power than you, some have less, and people can tag in and tag out.
Yeah.
The work moves forward, but sometimes you get to rotate in and rest a little bit.
And being and knowing that it's okay to rest, right? I mean,
Rest
and that's
is
the
radical.
thing because sometimes there's this sense of like, almost there's some FOMO associated with equity work,
yeah,
like, right?
no, I
if I'm
think
not a part of it, like
rest is radical. I mean, when you look back at some of the people who were doing some of the hardest work, they age so quickly because they didn't rest enough.
Right.
And I think we have to rest. I try to model it. I had some faculty recently I was talking to. I said, what are you all doing this summer? They said, I'm working all summer. I said, I'm not impressed. I'm taking off, right? The president's taking off. And so I think we have to model it that it's not that you just are taking the rest as a luxury. You need it to come back strong in the work.
I was reading a book several years ago called The Slow Professor. And one of the things in that book that I remember the authors were talking about is, they created this sort of scenario when you come back to campus like on a Monday or Tuesday or whatever, and you say you're talking to a colleague in the hallway and you're just casually chatting about your weekend, and this person says to you, oh yeah, I was working on this NSF grant all weekend. And it immediately sort of triggers this feeling in you of, well, why wasn't I doing that? Why did I take it off? And you realize there's a meta message of if you're not burning out, you're not doing it right. And you're right. I think we have to model that. You also talked about homophilia.
Yes.
And I thought it was a really interesting way to describe kinship and make that point. And it reminded me a little bit of a point I'd read in a book by James Baldwin and Margaret Mead called A Rap on Race, where he, there was a line where he says, so there's a whole kind of conversation they had throughout the entire book, and he was saying, I'm looking for the day when we no longer define ourselves by our ethnicity, but as Americans first, and as, he said it much in a much more articulate way than I just did, but it felt like that is what you're calling for, kind of a redefinition of the parameters for how we define, not to be dismissive of how we identify ethnically, religious-wise, whatever, but to not have those become so salient that it creates inherent divisions.
Yes.
And I mean, just my personal opinion, is maybe one of the more powerful lessons I had learned from plants, to the extent that's a lesson. Could you talk a little bit about that and where that kind of idea came from?
Yeah, I think it's just so critically important for us to recognize each other's humanity first. Doesn't mean you don't look at me and see that I'm a Black woman.
Right.
But do you see me as a human first?
Right.
And I think the way our society, particularly in America, is so focused on race first, and the ways in which we sort ourselves. It's not just race, right? We sort ourselves. If we're the same socioeconomic status, we might see each other as kin.
Yeah.
If we are all scientists, we see this commonality. And so I think it's this strangeness that we look for commonalities to connect with people, but the ways in which we do that are so much impacted by the social constructs, race, socioeconomic status, education versus not. And it is so interesting because often people that we are most closely related to, we don't even see them as our kin anymore, because now I'm in this middle class, higher education. And so it actually, we entrench into these camps where we really fight for the things that got us entry into that, as opposed to really seeing our own humanity and just the coreness of humanity. And I think if we could get to that, some of our problems, right? Climate change, poverty, homelessness, it's because when you see someone else, you don't even see yourself in that person anymore, right? Yeah.
So, okay, we're in education.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
How do we begin to teach that?
That's one I'm still, it's a challenge, right? It is a challenge because we're in education, we're in disciplines, and if I meet another biochemist, I'm like, hey, biochemist. And I was like, wait, am I feeding into the problem?
I got a C in biochem, so you are not my people.
I'm not your people. Oh, yeah. But I mean, I think one of them is to I think about the thing that keeps me in education and in science is my curiosity.
Okay.
And that's the thing that gets me to break out of that, being curious about someone. Because a lot of times the homophily is that we're not really curious and we can go straight to what we think we share in common.
Yeah.
Curiosity about the other person, but not in a kind of, I'm looking at animals in the zoo kind of curiosity, right? But this whole, what would happen if I had a conversation and didn't make presumptions? And so I think really elevating that curiosity.
Yeah. What would it be like if you had a conversation and didn't make presumptions?
Yes.
There's a term in restorative justice called apophatic listening.
Yes.
Which is, to me, is just sort of beautiful description of what it means to keep your thoughts in abeyance and allow something new to emerge from the interaction without you trying to superimpose your story, your life, your brain on it. And I know. I mean, that's a challenge, right? And
I think part of the answer is that we have to release our fears about difference, because fear is what causes you to make a judgment quickly, right? If you are afraid of dogs and you see a dog, the fear causes you to say, I got to get out of here quickly.
Right.
And so if we could lessen our fears about difference, we could sit in the space that you're talking about and not have the preconception. So we have so many fears. People are afraid. I will never forget, my son is now 6'2", and as he was about 13 and getting to be 6 feet, I saw people go from he's this cute little boy to, oh, now I see a black man, right?
Yeah.
And it's that fear. But we don't have conversations about fear, because our fears drive how we interact with each other, even in education, but we don't talk about that.
Did he pick up on those different
He
reactions?
did. He did. And he's such a social person. I remember his dad is from Uganda. And so, in America, when you're from a different country as a black person, you can have a different experience.
I know.
Right? And so his dad often engaged with people because people were curious about him.
Right,
And when he saw his son moving into this, he said, we need your son to sit with your brothers, your dad, who've grown up in the U.S., and to understand how you navigate that without losing yourself.
Yeah.
Right?
So, I mean, you told me earlier, he's 21 now.
21 today, yeah.
How is he now in terms of that space?
He's very...
And happy birthday to him.
Yeah, thank you. He's very aware and yet tries to stay engaged, right? And it's this delicate balance of being aware and trying to be open to the conversation with people who are open, but also taking care of yourself mentally and emotionally so you're not always trying to. So he's very adept at moving in and out of these spaces. And over the years, I've seen him have some conflicts with some friends about language choice or around election season, and they will navigate through it. And then I've also seen, I'm like, what happened to that friend? And he said, we tried, and it got to a point where it was too much for me. And so it's been really interesting to watch him navigate that space. And to try to affirm him in those choices, right? That there are times where you want to be able to lean into people's curiosity, and then there are days where it's not the day that you can handle that. And navigating that and giving yourself grace and permission.
Yeah, being okay with that. Did he become a patent lawyer?
No. So he is studying engineering and anthropology, very interested in culturally relevant impacts of engineering. So I don't know exactly where it will take him, but as I was saying how I grew up with parents who said you got to get this education or your life is over, he has a little bit more flexibility to explore, and it's fun to watch.
I am going to take as a given that all that food coloring is what led to this.
I think it's the Legos.
Somehow it weaved its way into this very interesting mix. So I think that's good. Well, best of luck to him, and I really appreciate
so much.
So what's next after Lessons from Plants? What sort of so there's sort of two questions here. I know you mentioned at some point that you have other book projects.
Yeah.
Well, Lessons from Plants had a very particular message for our community. What's the follow up to that message in your mind? That whether you deliver that follow-up or not, but what's the follow-up message to Lessons from Plants?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the lessons I hope people get, and I've talked about this a lot, is I've been invited into all kind of communities, from economists to forensic scientists and other places to talk about lessons from plants. That part of the lesson that I hope comes for everyone is that there are lessons all around us for our own self-reflection and our own thinking, right? And so whatever you do as a profession, whatever your hobbies are, there's enjoyment there, but there are also some lessons for us if we self-reflect. And I think the more that we can share those, we can help each other have different perspectives around these really tough ideas and hopefully move things forward. And so that's my biggest hope, is that it is an example of what's possible. The other thing that I've really leaned into, a friend of mine, Chanda Prescott Weinstein, had a book out at the same time I did. She's a physicist. She had a book out, The Disordered Cosmos. And one of the lessons from our books that she and I and others have talked about, Black women, is that the lessons from plant is also an example that you can be someone who does social justice or Black feminist work from science. You don't have to go into sociology. And I think that's been eye-opening. Both of us have encountered young Black women who said, I was about to get out of science because I didn't want to do this, but now I see that science can take us into many different conversations, and I think that is important as well. So,
that's wonderful. So let me ask you this as a closing. When you're not book writing, when you're not being a scholar, when you're not being an administrator, what's the thing or things you enjoy doing most?
So one of the things I enjoy doing most is traveling. And my favorite travel partners are my sister, who's 3 years older than me, and she's my best friend, and my son. The three of us make an amazing trio. And we've traveled the world. And we have so they have shared interests in African American history, and they're both foodies. And I have different interests. So we go to this place, and one day I choose the things that I want to do, and then another day he chooses and she chooses. And we really try to enjoy each other's company. So I really enjoy exploring new places, new food, traveling, and they are great travel companions.
Is there anything that you learn from your non-work hobbies that sort of comes back to impact your writing, your scholarship?
Yeah,
and your
it's
thinking?
funny that you say that, because the next book I'm writing actually starts with the day trip I took with the two of them. So they are very much into African American history. We were in Charleston, South Carolina, and they wanted to visit plantations. I had no interest. I'm like, I don't. Family past has been there. I don't think I need to go.
I'll see you at Taco Bell.
Yes, yeah. But they said, yesterday we went to the botanical garden and looked at all these plants all day with you. So you're coming.
Right.
And so we went, and at one of the plantations, I encountered a 400-year-old tree. And it occurred to me that
wow.
that tree was alive at the same
Yeah.
time our enslaved ancestors were
yeah,
there.
yeah.
And me understanding photosynthesis the way I do, I said, their breath, their carbon dioxide is captured in the wood of this tree, right? So we're literally standing with their captured breath. And my next tree is called When Trees Testify. And it's about looking at,
Your next book, you mean?
yeah, my next book.
Okay.
So what did I say?
You said your next tree.
Oh, see, I'm so into the plants. My next book is called When Trees
We
Testify.
are keeping that in.
And it's really about how standing at that tree led me to re-understand kind of my legacy as a Black plant scientist, that many of my enslaved ancestors were there, not just because they were strong, but because they were botanical experts.
Yeah.
And standing with that tree just changed me in a way. So my son is waiting on his cut from the book Advance because he said, you didn't want to go. We dragged you there. And so now you think this is what's happening. So those kinds of experiences do change me a lot. Yeah,
Well, I'm really looking forward to reading that.
Thank you.
I mean, I guess partly given my background, when you use the word testify, people they have
I didn't
expectations.
know that until early, but I chose that intentionally.
Right, yeah. They have expectations when you say that.
Yeah.
Dr. Montgomery, is a pleasure.
Thank
having
you
this
so much.
conversation with you. Look forward to seeing that book come out and hearing more from the audience when they read it.
Thank you so much. This was so much fun. Thank you for inviting me. I really enjoyed this conversation.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Just what did the struggle make of you? Did it take your everything? Did it break you? Did you find that you had inside whatever it takes to make it to the next level? Phase 1 to phase 2. Did you let them face you when they try to blaze you? Did you give them props when they didn't even amaze you?
Knowledge Unbound is brought to you by the Rios Institute for a racially just, inclusive open STEM education. We are generously funded by the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation. Our producer, Mr. Segev Amasai, computer engineering major, class of 2025, Florida International University. Closing song by artist Infinite the Ghost from Providence, Rhode Island. His name is Marlon Carey. The song is called Breakthrough. We would especially like to thank Dr. Beronda Montgomery for spending the last hour with us, for sharing her story, her journey, her sense of why, her reflections, and the ways in which she will continue to impact the STEM universe going forward. I have heard Dr. Montgomery speak several times, and I feel like every time I've listened, I've just taken one more new thing from it. And I guess this time, perhaps, through conversation. And I know we closed on it and we didn't get into it because it's our next project. But what does it mean to testify? What does it mean to be in the presence of things that are communicating to you that history matters? And that the work we do in education, in our classrooms, in our research, is in service to those ancestors who gave so much for us to be here and be alive and to thrive. So with these words, my friends, thank you for tuning in. I wish you a great week. And as you go forth, please be excellent to each other.
So I really started to use the plants as a way to say, if a plant is growing and it's struggling in its health, we don't look at the plant and say, well, you plant have a deficit and can't grow, right? We start to ask questions. Who watered it last? Does it need nutrients? Does Brian always kill plants? If so, maybe he shouldn't have plants. One of the things that I like about being an administrator is that if you figure out the system well enough, sometimes you can use levers that are there to make different things possible for people. You can invest in new areas. And so I think for me, one of the things that brought me to administration is to ask what work I could do to try to make it a little easier for someone who sees their career in a non-standard way, the way I see mine, not have to fight so hard to do it. So I think there are ways to still try not to, because I agree with you, too many relationships fall apart. Kids' relationships are not as strong as they could be because we don't figure out that how can I honor you even in this space where there's another demand on my time.